All right, today we're changing our focus from crunchy, crusty, and large loaves to smaller, softer, and super tender rolls. We're gonna make my super soft sourdough roll recipe, and it's one of my favorite to make during the holidays. I make it every Thanksgiving. In fact, they're the rolls that are on the back of my new sourdough cookbook, and they look super soft and squishy and light because that's exactly what they are. And the reason they are is because I use two special techniques to make these rolls happen. The first one is a sweet pre-ferment or a sweet levain. So we're gonna add some sugar to our levain, and it's kind of a different way to bring about a different flavor profile in the end roll. And then we're also gonna use the Tangzhong technique for pre-cooking some of the flour. This brings even more softness and tenderness. So the flavor with these rolls is something you really wouldn't expect or associate with sourdough. Because we use our sweet levain and the way the flour is designed in this recipe and the way the fermentation schedule is designed, you're gonna end up with rolls that have just kind of a really mild and almost like a buttermilk sourness instead of like a sharp pungent sourness. And then with the Tangzhong technique that we use, the texture of these rolls is incredibly light and soft. They're very tender. They kind of tear and shred apart. And it's really the quintessential roll that you wanna have kind of at Thanksgiving. I also like to use them, it sounds strange, but I cut them into slices kind of horizontally, and I make French toast out of these. These are like French toast medallions. It's just ridiculous how good these are. Lots of uses for these rolls. I don't know if they're gonna last past your holiday meal or your dinner meal because they're that good, but if any do, sandwiches for the next day and French toast for sure. So in this recipe, I use a technique called Tangzhong, pre-cooking some of the flour in some of the liquid in the recipe before you get to mixing. What this does is it simply gelatinizes the starches that are in the flour, and it causes the mixture to form this kind of like gel-like paste. That gel paste brings a lot of softness and tenderness to these rolls, and I find that also helps keep them softer for longer even after baking them. One of the unique techniques I'm using for this recipe is what's commonly called a sweet levain or a sweet pre-ferment. And what that is we're simply taking some of the sugar in the total formula and we're adding it to the levain. It suppresses bacteria in a way that it doesn't suppress yeasts. So if you're familiar with the kind of symbiotic relationship in our sourdough starter, we have wild yeasts and bacteria kind of living in harmony or a symbiotic relationship. And bacteria is primarily responsible for generating that sourness that we're used to in kind of the flavor of sourdough bread. And yeasts are primarily responsible for the leavening or making things rise. What it does is it skews the flavor profile of the pre-ferment towards a less sour result, which directly translates to rolls or bread. You still have some sourness and some complexity, which is exactly what we want, and that's why we're using natural leavening. But you don't have this sharp sourness or this really heavy sour profile that you might have you might expect in a free form or hearth loaf. Okay, let's quickly talk about the timeline for this recipe. So I designed this recipe to be baked and mixed and shaped and everything all in one day. And I designed it this way because there is nothing better than fresh, soft rolls for dinner. And while you're baking these, preparing dinner, the aroma just kind of infuses your kitchen and it really just sets the stage for an amazing dinner. I do call for an overnight levain, so I prepared the levain the night before and I let it ripen overnight for 12 hours. If you want to spread the recipe out over the course of 3 days, you can do the overnight levain and then mix the dough, get it all the way into the point where you shape and divide it and put it in the pan. Then you can cover those rolls and put them in the refrigerator and bake them the next day if you want to have them for lunch, or you can leave them in the refrigerator and just make that day's prep for dinner a lot easier. Okay, let's talk about the ingredients that are needed to make these super soft rolls. So I call for 2 different types of flour for this recipe. I call for using a high protein white flour, so something like a King Arthur bread flour would be great. And I also call for a medium protein white flour. So if you're gonna use King Arthur, their all-purpose would be great as well. If you only have one type of flour, that'll totally be fine too. But I find adding a little bit of the high protein white flour kind of gives a little bit more structure to these rolls and you get a little bit more of a tall rise. And I also call for some whole milk that'll be used to make the Tangzhong mixture. And I also call for your typical fine sea salt. But then for this recipe, I also add a percentage of superfine white sugar. So that is also sometimes called castor sugar. If you don't have superfine white sugar, just use any white sugar or the finest sugar you have in your kitchen. I also call for 95 grams of butter, and this is unsalted butter. I like to cut that up, cube it up, and leave it on a plate to warm while I'm mixing all the rest of the ingredients. You're also going to need some water, and then you need your sourdough starter that's ripe and ready to make the overnight levain. Before baking the rolls, we're also going to make an egg wash, so you need 1 egg and a splash of milk, and then you'll also optionally need some coarse sea salt. I like to use Maldon sea salt just before baking. The equipment that you're going to need for this recipe, some of it's optional and some of it I highly recommend. So the first one to start with is a stand mixer. So I'm using my 7-quart KitchenAid stand mixer. I love using a stand mixer for rolls and especially enriched doughs because it really helps work in any egg or butter or sugar that you have. We're going to mix the dough without the butter for a while until we strengthen the gluten in the dough. And once that's strong, then we'll add the butter, which is really another stressor to this dough. You need your usual culprits, your instant read thermometer, your bench scraper and bowl scrapers. You'll need a small saucepan to make the Tangzhong mixture for this recipe. And then as far as baking the rolls, you have really 2 options. And I have a 9-inch square USA pan that I love using for these rolls. This has a natural non-stick silicone liner. You don't want to use a square pan and you have a circular pan. This is a 10-inch diameter Lloyd pan. It also has a non-stick liner on the inside. And I love this pan. I usually use it for focaccia, but it's great also for these rolls. First step for this recipe is to make your pre-ferment or your levain. So this sweet levain, again, has some sugar in it, and we're gonna mix it the night before we want to mix and bake our rolls. In a tall jar, I would use a taller jar than normal because with the sugar added, you're gonna see that levain will rise incredibly high in your container. Add to it 74 grams of your medium protein or all-purpose white flour. Add 15 grams of superfine sugar and also add 74 grams of water. And then you're going to want to add 30 grams of your ripe sourdough starter. Add all those things to your levain container, mix it up really well, and then cover it and let it ferment overnight until ready. Before we get to mixing, you need to make sure you make your Tangzhong mixture a little bit ahead of time to ensure that it gives it enough time to cool. So I usually like to do it 15 to 20 minutes ahead of time. In a saucepan over your range, mix together 41 grams of the white flour, so the all-purpose flour that you're using, and add 166 grams of the milk. Turn on your range to medium-low and cook for about 8 to 10 minutes until that mixture turns into a real gel-like paste. And while it's cooking, be sure to whisk kind of frequently to make sure that the flour mixture doesn't burn. It'll be very loose and runny for a long while, and then after about 6 or 7 minutes, all of a sudden that mixture will turn very viscous and kind of this gel-like paste. Once you get to that point, the temperature should be around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and spread that out on a plate and let it cool until mixing. All right, the third step in this recipe is we're gonna start doing our mixing. So we've made our levain, it's ripened overnight, it's ready to go this morning, and we've made our Tangzhong mixture earlier, and we've also set out our butter. So the Tangzhong should be nice and cool around room temp. It's okay if it's a little warmer, and the butter should be at room temp at this point, so a finger press into the butter will very easily slide in. First, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add the flour, the water, the salt, the sugar, the levain, and the Tangzhong mixture, all of that into our mixing bowl, and we're gonna start mixing on medium-low speed. After everything is incorporated on low speed, turn the mixer up to number 2 on the KitchenAid mixer, or medium speed if you have a different mixer, and mix for about 5 to 6 minutes until the dough starts to kind of cling to the dough hook, and you'll notice it'll start to strengthen up, but it won't be fully developed at this point, just enough to kind of get the gluten started in development. Okay, you'll see after the first pass of mixing, the dough will be quite strong in the mixer. It'll be clumped up around the dough hook. It's still shaggy. If you pull on it, it still tears apart, so it's not fully developed. We haven't really gone to the point where we pass a window pane test, but it's strong enough right now to let it rest, so let it rest for 10 minutes. The dough is rested now for 10 minutes, covered in the mixing bowl. We're going to start adding in the room temperature butter. So what we'll do is we'll turn the mixer on low speed and we'll add the butter in one kind of cube or one piece at a time. And we'll wait to add more butter until the previous addition is absorbed into the dough. Okay, at this point we're done mixing in all of the butter. It took about 5 to 6 minutes. The dough isn't super smooth, but it's shiny and it's very soft, and that's from all the butter and the pre-cooked flour addition. So at this point, just scrape it out of the mixing bowl and into your bulk fermentation container. Use your thermometer to take the dough's temperature. It should be right around 25 degrees Celsius or 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and cover your dough. Set a timer for 30 minutes. We'll come back and give it its first set of stretches and folds. All right, it's been 30 minutes into bulk fermentation. We'll give the dough its first set of stretches and fold. So this is the first out of 3. Have a small bowl of water nearby to dip your hands into to keep it non-stick. After your bowl's uncovered, dip your hands in the bowl to get them wet. Stretch up and fold over once for each side of the dough. So I like to start on the side farthest from me, stretch it up and over and down, rotate the bowl 180 degrees, repeat the same thing, and then rotate the bowl 90 degrees so you're working on the remaining 2 sides. Recover your bowl and set another timer for 30 minutes, and we'll give the dough its second set. Okay, so it's been 30 more minutes, so we're an hour into bulk fermentation. Now we'll give the dough our second set of stretches and folds. So just do the same process, uncover the dough, wet your hands, and give the dough a stretch and fold on each side. Then recover your dough and set another timer for 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been now an hour and a half into bulk fermentation. My dough is looking quite strong in the container here. You can see that it's holding itself together. So I'm not gonna do a vigorous set of stretches and folds with this one. I'm gonna do a gentle set. I'm basically just gonna put my hands underneath, just lift the dough up and let it fall in the container. And rotate the container and do it again on the other side. This gentle set isn't going to do a lot of strengthening. It's more about just kind of organizing the dough. Recover your dough. Let this dough now rest for the remainder of bulk fermentation. So the total bulk fermentation time will be 3.5 hours. So cover your dough and let it rest for 2 hours. It's been 3.5 hours in bulk fermentation, and the dough has risen well in the container. It's not massively risen and it's not super gassy and very delicate. So a poke with your finger will kind of display signs of a soft and airy dough, but it's not going to be very broken down and very fragile. If your dough feels really slack and kind of sticky and hard to handle, you can place your bulk fermentation container right in the refrigerator, just cover it for maybe 15 to 25 minutes and let that dough kind of firm up, but not so much that it gets like rock hard and cold. It should be still very workable and kind of soft to the touch, but a little bit firmer and easier to handle. Okay, now that we know that our dough is ready to be divided into these small rounds and ready for proofing, have your tools on hand for doing that. So you need your bowl scraper to get the dough out of the bulk container, your bench scraper to help divide and shape the dough. Be sure to have your pan liberally buttered, and if yours doesn't have a nonstick liner, you can line your pan with parchment paper just to be sure that the rolls don't stick during baking. You'll also need your kitchen scale nearby. We're going to divide this dough into 16 pieces, each weighing 70 grams. So that gives us 16 little rolls that we'll put in 4 rows of 4 in our square pan. And the last thing is you need some white flour nearby. So this will help to dust the dough and make sure that it doesn't stick to our hands. Some white flour to just dust the top of the dough. Dust the top of the dough with some white flour. And your hands as well to keep them non-stick. For very soft dough like this, I prefer to use my bench scraper to help shape the dough. So what I do is cut down into the dough and make .70-gram pieces. So continue to divide all of this dough so you'll have 16 pieces in the end, and then I will show you how to shape each roll and place it right into the pan. I hold the bench scraper at a pretty high angle with respect to the work surface, and that allows me to really aggressively tighten the dough as I push and drag it against the work surface. I use my free hand to keep the dough off the bench scraper and to help it tuck under itself. By the end, you'll form a really nice tight ball. And just continue to build out your 4 rows of 4 rolls. After you've shaped all 16 pieces of dough, they should line up nicely in your pan. Let these rolls proof for 2 to 3 hours at warm room temperature. So cover them and we'll check back in a couple hours. Okay, it's been 3 hours in proof for me in these rolls. So the dough has risen about 3/4 of the way up to the rim of the container, but the most important visual indicator and textural indicator is that a finger press into the dough shows a dough that's very light and very airy. And if you test and you feel any kind of dense spots in the dough, then give the dough an extra 15 to 20 minutes to proof longer. So before we bake these, I have my oven preheating. For the egg wash, it's as simple as 1 whole egg and a splash of milk. Use a fork to just kind of whisk everything together until it's homogeneous. What we'll do is we'll brush on the egg wash on the top of the dough on each of the rolls. Coarse salt to top each bun. Slide the pan into the oven and bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. Then rotate the pan 180 degrees, reduce the temperature to 350 and bake for another 20 minutes until golden brown. All right, that's all there is to it for these soft sourdough rolls. I love this recipe and I think you will too. And they're amazing around the holidays and really just a special roll for any dinner. And what I love about them is that they really push the boundaries for sourdough and natural fermentation. Using a sweet levain and the Tangzhong technique, I think it's a unique way to make a really soft and very light roll. I'll leave a full description to all the ingredients and a link to a written form of the recipe in the description below. And if you don't have my cookbook, that is also available and the recipe is inside. Happy baking.